Transport for London is still planning big cuts despite a multi-billion-pound funding offer from the government. The Mayor has warned of a 10% cut to bus services, the possible closure of tube lines and the cancellation of other major improvement projects in the capital. Our political correspondent Simon Harris has the latest.
London's public transport system has been on life support for more than 2 years. Ever since COVID robbed the tubes, trains, buses and trams of fare-paying passengers, Transport for London has needed emergency bailouts from the government to the tune of £5 billion. Now, after months of wrangling between City Hall and Whitehall, the government has come up with a new offer. But what it is still unclear.
We do need to look at the fine detail of it, but I welcome the fact that government have made a proposal. We now need to look through it in fine detail to make sure that we're comfortable with it before we can accept it.
In a tweet, the Transport Secretary said, despite the Mayor of London failing to provide required info for TfL finance extensions, I've put a long-term settlement on the table to ensure services are supported and £3.6 billion of capital projects take place by 2024. The ball is now firmly in the Mayor's court. But is it enough to stop what the Mayor calls managed decline, big cuts to tube and bus services and the cancellation of major infrastructure projects? And is it enough to resurrect schemes like the Bakerloo line extension and Crossrail 2? Like his Transport Commissioner, the Mayor is being cautious, mindful that the offer from the government might not be all it seems.
We know from previous offers from the government there are often strings attached. The devil's often in the details. So let's wait and see what the TfL officials say. We may need a short extension to look at it properly. What I will not do is accept a deal that's going to be damaging to our city. The good news is the government has finally made a deal.
The Mayor has warned that without the right deal, he'll be forced to cut almost 1 in 5 bus services, abandon plans to replace clapped-out old tube trains, as well as possibly closing an entire underground line, and scrap major road improvements like repairs to the Brent Cross flyover. The government has accused him of scaremongering and called on him to find other ways of saving money.
I think they want him to get a grip of TfL's finances. He's got to make some difficult decisions. He needs to really tackle the issue of TfL pensions, which are gold-plated, and we've estimated at the London Assembly that he could save around £100 million just by tackling that issue alone.
Today, the Mayor formally opened the overground extension to Barking Riverside, London's third new railway in the last 12 months. How many years Londoners will have to wait for the next new scheme is anybody's guess. Simon Harris, ITV News, Barking Riverside.
Fears of a drought took a step closer today after a top-level government meeting. Water companies in London and the home counties say they're not looking at a hosepipe ban yet, but the heat waves in the coming weeks could push the capital closer to a water shortage. Our political correspondent Simon Harris has more.
Feeding time on the farm. Normally these cows at Chillickbury near St Albans would spend the summer feasting on grass. But their fields are parched, the grass has stopped growing, and Vicky is forced to raid the cows' winter food supplies.
There's a lack of grass because of the limited rain, and we're having to feed them additional hay that would be used to feed them through the winter. We're having to feed them in the field at the moment because there's no grass.
A week ago, the heatwave triggered wildfires, destroying homes in the village of Wennington and on a housing estate in Dagenham. Today, the Environment Agency called a meeting of the government's National Drought Group amid fears that further hot weather could cause a water shortage. Across London and the home counties, water levels are below average for this time of year. It hasn't yet reached a critical point, but the water companies are still asking people to use less. And while there's no immediate threat of a hosepipe ban, it's a measure the companies will keep under review.
We've only had about 4% of the rainfall that we would normally expect for July, and it's been the driest 8 months since 1976. So very, very dry. That being said, our reservoirs are in good shape for this year. They're about 80% full on average.
The drought of 1976 saw trees in London's parks dying of thirst. The government set up an emergency centre in the capital, and a Minister for Drought was appointed to take charge of the crisis. While we're not there yet, there is a warning about what lies ahead.
If we experience another dry and above average temperature winter, then we could be in a very different situation next year. So the impacts of the extreme weather, while significant, are not yet as severe as we saw in 1976.
But for farmers especially, it's not just worrying, but expensive. The lack of grass means spending more money on animal feed, putting an additional cost on meat and dairy products. Simon Harris, ITV News, Chillickbury.
Good evening, and we start with some breaking news tonight. Sir Keir Starmer has fired Ilford MP Sam Tarry for appearing on the picket line during today's rail strikes. Mr Tarry was the Shadow Minister for Transport. He spoke to ITV News London earlier, saying he didn't think Sir Keir would give him the sack. Well, it comes as Londoners found alternative ways to cope with the rail strike in what is becoming an increasingly familiar scenario this summer. Our political correspondent Simon Harris reports.
The idea of a rail strike causing chaos may be for the history books. This was Waterloo during the morning rush hour. It's estimated only 1 in 5 trains were running. But thanks to COVID, Londoners have learned to work from home and factor in the school holidays, and today's commute wasn't as painful as it might have been.
One train got delayed and I had to get a bus to a different train station, but yeah, it cost me about half an hour.
It was okay. I had to walk half an hour further than I usually would because they weren't going from my station.
I understand why they're striking, so I mean they're entitled to strike for what they believe is right.
Turtza only found out about the strike this morning just before arriving at Hendon Station. She was hoping to get home to Israel.
I'm trying to get to Gatwick Airport to get home to my family and children. And I really, really hope I'll get there in time. I'm actually pretty scared.
Kevin, who lives in Berkhamsted, supports Germany and was looking forward to tonight's Euros semi in Milton Keynes. But thanks to the strike, his ticket was a waste of money.
Technically, I could actually get to the game, but when the game finishes, maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock tonight, if it goes to extra time and penalties, I'll be marooned in Milton Keynes because there will be no trains to get back.
On the RMT's picket line in Euston, Sam Tarry, an East London MP and Shadow Minister, showed his support, despite an instruction from Sir Keir Starmer ordering Labour MPs to stay away.
No one has said anything to me about whether I should be on or not be on a picket line today. What's really clear to me...
Are you worried that he might sack you?
No, because I believe that if Keir Starmer was in number 10, we wouldn't have this dispute.
This latest strike was called after the RMT rejected a fresh pay offer from Network Rail.
It's a decent deal, so it's 8% over 2 years. It's subsidised travel, 75% off travel for colleagues and their immediate family, but most importantly, a guaranteed no compulsory redundancy, which is something the RMT have been asking for.
To make things even more complicated, the RMT is also in dispute with some of the train companies.
Our members have shown us very strongly that the offer from Network Rail is entirely unacceptable, and the problem with the train operating companies, they've not made an offer at all on pay. All they've done is set out their demands, which is to close all the booking offices in Britain, put our members on new contracts of employment that are inferior.
Despite the best efforts of the RMT, the rail companies said more people travelled by train today than during the last strike 5 weeks ago.
Well, Simon, since Mr Tarry spoke to you, he's discovered that he's no longer part of Sir Keir's team, is he?
Yes, Mr Tarry must have known his appearance on the picket line would infuriate Sir Keir, and sure enough this afternoon he was sacked as a member of Labour's front bench transport team. Labour said it wasn't because he appeared on a picket line, but because he disregarded the collective responsibility he signed up to as a member of Sir Keir's shadow team. A short time ago, Mr Tarry had this to say.
It's a real shame today that for joining a picket line, for being on a picket line, standing shoulder to shoulder, not just with striking rail workers, but my former colleagues from the TSSA union, people that I know that are good friends from the RMT. And I want to be part of a Labour Party and always stand up for a Labour Party that stands in solidarity with workers in their disputes, wherever that may be in this country.
Incidentally, Mr Tarry was already in trouble with his local party in Ilford South, where he faces the possibility of being deselected as Labour's candidate at the next election.
And Simon, more strikes coming down the line.
Yes, the next one is by the train drivers' union ASLEF, and that's on Saturday, involving 5 rail companies which operate in and out of London, including London Overground. That strike will be repeated on August the 13th, and then it's the RMT's turn to revive strikes on Network Rail and on the Underground on the 18th, 19th and 20th of August. So quite a packed summer timetable of strikes.
Yeah, it really is. Simon at King's Cross, thank you.
Next tonight, it is not just the Tories having a bout of infighting. Diane Abbott has described the sacking of Ilford South MP Sam Tarry as extraordinary and wrong. He joined a rail strike yesterday, but the Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has insisted he sacked the MP for making up policy on the hoof, not for joining that picket line. Here's our political correspondent Simon Harris.
When Sam Tarry joined striking rail workers on a Euston picket line, he knew his party leader would be furious. And he only made matters worse when he shared his views on pay rises.
You can't go into negotiations and offer people below inflation when inflation's running at nearly 11%. That's totally unacceptable.
It cost him his job as a Labour transport spokesperson.
Sam Tarry was sacked because he booked himself onto media programmes without permission and then made up policy on the hoof, and that can't be tolerated in any organisation.
He's not being sacked for making up policy, he's being sacked for going on a picket line, and that is quite wrong.
Mr Tarry's sacking has sparked a renewed bout of infighting between moderates and left-wingers in the Labour Party.
This is a total disaster. We cannot turn our backs on 7 million trade unionists, and anyone who thinks that we can't win an election without support of the trade union movement is totally deluded.
Mr Tarry also has problems closer to home in his East London constituency. Sam Tarry was chosen as Labour's candidate for Ilford South in 2019 in a bitter and divisive contest which has left lingering bad feelings. He's now fighting for his political career. Mr Tarry's rival in that selection process was Jazz Athwell, a Labour moderate and leader of Redbridge Council. But at the last minute, Councillor Athwell was controversially suspended by the party and banned from taking part. Ilford South Labour Party now looks set to force Mr Tarry to take part in a new selection.
If I had to put money on it now, and these things can be highly unpredictable, I think that probably Sam Tarry will be replaced as the Labour candidate for Ilford South the next general election.
For his part, Sam Tarry says he has no regrets about joining the picket line. Simon Harris, ITV News.